I have had multiple requests for a video deep diving game keycards, and until now I have left this topic to others. This is mainly because at this point it seemed to me to be a technical question of what the keys offered, how and why, and that's not really something I'm especially good at breaking down. However, enough has been put out there that I feel like there is now scope to look both at what the cards seem to do and then to analyze what the implications are for Nintendo and for the rest of the game market. So, let's start by summarizing what, as far as I can tell, these key cards are all about. Introduced as a variant to regular game cards and direct digital downloads, these are a replacement for the Switch editions, which were simply a download key in a box. I can't say I ever bought such a game title myself, but while I can see that these offer the chance to sell in-store games that would otherwise be restricted to the Switch's digital storefront, it also seems to me quite unsatisfactory. For one thing, as a user experience, these codes are presumably being bought significantly by people as gifts, meaning that the first experience of a Nintendo product for some may be a complicated code and a long download. Not a very good user experience. Game keycards offer not just an actual physical object to represent and link to the game, but also allow for that game to be shared and distributed in the same way as a regular game card, albeit subject to download times. This is far more consumer friendly than the codes of old. However, in other respects, game keycards are still far from satisfactory. The major issue is that in terms of game preservation, they are basically useless. The keycards will only hold value as long as the games are held on Nintendo servers, but as long as they're on Nintendo servers, they will probably be available digitally and preservation won't be an issue. It may be that some companies decide, for their own reasons, to pull games from circulation early but still honour the keycards, but even then, in the space of decades, it seems improbable that keycards will be honoured indefinitely. This perhaps brings to the forefront an issue that has long plagued storage media of all sorts, and that is longevity. While optical media seems to last fairly well, barring scratches, VHS and audio cassettes are prone to failure, and video game cartridges and cards have always had questions over them. It seems, as far as I can tell, that most 8-bit and 16-bit cartridges will last quite well if stored properly, but those with small batteries included, usually for save files, can see those corrode over time. Personally, I've tried several older games in recent years, and they've all worked fine with the exception of Sonic 3, which of course does have a save file in it. DS and 3DS cartridges, on the other hand, reportedly can suffer over time, but this is mainly from flash memory only being able to support a limited number of write cycles, but your classic plastic wrapped game, as new, should still in theory be as good as any other even decades hence. And this is where game keycards represent a major regression. Most games until now have released in some form physically on Switch. Even games like Splatoon, which would lose large amounts of functionality without an internet connection, still have the benefit of at least some elements remaining offline on the game card, and frequently with titles that receive updates, later versions of the cartridge include the most up-to-date versions, as indicated on the game card itself. For example, the Mario Kart 8 Day 1 copy, which is 1.0.0, appears to have a cartridge code of AABPA 22A000, whereas editions with 1.71 on have the first part the same, AABPA, but then a different final code, 41X004. Even this is rather thin gruel for preservationists, as most of these titles have DLC, which is not reflected in any physical update. And if you think these game preservation issues are a distant and hypothetical issue, one needs only consider the terrible fate of many Sega Saturn games, including beloved classics like Panzer Dragoon Saga, where the original code has been long lost, the machine is not overly easy to emulate, and desperately few copies of one of the greatest RPGs of the age were ever even produced. Sega still don't appear to have learned their lesson even today. While a great many third parties are hopping on the game keycard bandwagon, Sega seem to not just have bought into this, but even physical copies of Sonic Cross Shadow Generations for Switch can't be upgraded, meaning that the only option for a Switch 2 version of this game is through a keycard. The logic of keycards for publishers is undeniable and apparently irresistible. It keeps down the cost of the game cards dramatically, especially for games which are generally far larger than Nintendo's own efforts in terms of gigabytes. It also hooks people into a more digital infrastructure, which is of interest to many publishers because the margins are generally higher, achieved by cutting out the costs of physical distribution. Granted, this has smaller benefits for third parties as they still are locked into Nintendo's store. Still, this is a cheap and cheerful way to ensure that these games have a shelf presence, especially around the holiday seasons. Of course, against the backdrop of an absolute meltdown by chunks of the gamer fanbase over an $80 Mario Kart, the prospect of game key cards being air quotes a mere $70 but without a physical game on them is cold comfort. The question ultimately becomes, is this just the way of things for the future? Nintendo have made the choice to seemingly only put out cartridges of up to 64 gigabytes in capacity, but they surely negotiated with third parties on this matter well in advance. Nintendo's compression skills are legendary, and it strikes me as unlikely that even the Zeldas of this world would push past 64 gigabytes on Switch 2. That's nearly 3 whole Mario Kart worlds if they filled up the whole cartridge, but third parties who are less adept at compression would need assistance. If 128 gigabytes cards could potentially cost an extra $10 or $20 to manufacture, this would either compress the percentage margins of retailers and manufacturers or lead in a snap to $100 titles on shelves. Absorbing the outrage of $80 is one thing when Mario Kart is just one game at present, available for effectively $50 anyway, and the marketplace will soon be full of titles of that expense or greater in any event. But for third parties, this would be far more decisive in influencing whether or not to bring their game content to Switch 2. From a preservation perspective, though, and in the case of third party titles, the majority are ports, and of course, we already have a situation where a good deal of indie titles have never had a physical edition anyway. In a sense, this is just expediting a trend that has been underway for a very long time, and it's hard to think that preservation is absolutely vital for the fifth version of an expanded port of Sonic Generations. What I will find far more interesting is the treatment of any Switch 2 exclusive editions. If the Duskbloods is a game keycard, that could be problematic, and it may well be that the acquisition of Shiver was a step towards having a studio that could help with compression issues. Beyond that, this comes down to Nintendo's view of game ownership and preservation. It's fair to say that the ability of individuals to continue to own copies of these pieces of art is really of little intrinsic interest to Nintendo. After all, they want to keep selling and profiting from these titles in perpetuity, so it is not necessarily in their interest to bend over backwards for the minority of collectors who wish to have their own copies going forward long into the future. But do Nintendo have their own plans to safeguard their works for a future generation? While the Nintendo Museum is a tilt towards preserving the storied legacy of Nintendo content, the fact is that the company has often been rather blasé about the need to guard its past, with reports of classic design documents having coffee cups resting on them on desks, while Miyamoto himself was surprised a few years ago to learn that SRD still had design documents from the original Super Mario Bros. Title, which he thought was long lost. The concept of preserving a record of the artistic process doesn't really seem to have entered Nintendo's thinking, and in a way I can understand that. It's a lot harder to be creative and to think the unthinkable if someone is going to dredge up a record in 30 years' time of all the mad 2 a.m. thoughts that you had. But in terms of the final games themselves, they hopefully are more defensive, although the ambiguous status of the Satellaview titles may give gamers pause even there. I do think the current board more than ever is committed to long-term thinking And one only need look at Marvel to see where things can go badly wrong with a lack of foresight. Their short sighted decision to sell film franchising rights to their characters to all and sundry in the 1990s has created a complete quagmire that they are still unpicking today, with Spider Man having spent decades at Sony, the X Men at Fox, and the Avengers at Disney. Nintendo hasn't been this short sighted, but they may one day regret it if they don't take preservation of their core content extremely seriously. From bitter experience, the Japanese are more acutely aware than most of the devastating consequences of mass destruction events, from earthquakes and tsunamis to nuclear strikes, all of these events having taken place on Japanese soil multiple times and comfortably during the lifetime of Nintendo as a company. I would hope that Nintendo would have robust game preservation policies of their own, such that the code for these games are as well protected as great works of art which, during the London Blitz, were spirited away from the city and kept in castles beneath Wales to protect them for future generations. Even setting aside long-term preservation issues, Nintendo may feel that in the medium term they're golden. The Switch and Switch 2 are clearly conceived of as part of the same ecosystem, and it's completely possible that they see their strategy into the future as being further consoles that still use the same infrastructure. In other words, barring compatibility issues such as those encountered with some Switch titles moving over to Switch 2, they would want to be able to carry forward the same ever-growing library. Of course, this is a hostage to fortune, as even if they continue to emulate Switch on a putative Switch 3, something which strikes me as far from certain, the number of games to check compatibility with would escalate ever upwards. Then there are logistical issues. We are currently in a world where cloud computing rules in many cases and online infrastructure is key, but it doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to see a world where vital internet routes could be sabotaged and games could be far less reliable than they are today, causing potentially a sudden and dramatic interruption in the ability of some Nintendo Switch games to be sold. Even if not, Kit and Krista recently noted that Nintendo had better have an absolutely ironclad systems architecture in place to prevent crashes on day one as everybody tries to download their new titles. And this is only going to be a prelude to where Nintendo might be on Christmas days in a few years' time when the install base is, they hope, approaching 9 figures. Then again, these may seem like more manageable risks compared to the prospect of a world where physical storage stops declining in expense and starts becoming far more costly due to any number of issues around chip production. Cheap and cheerful chips like the game key cards are a great backup plan for Nintendo in this kind of world, because they could in theory be produced with less cost and with, in the great tradition of Nintendo, withered technology compared to the 64 GB cards. As for brick and mortar stores, this does provide some insulation from the inevitable encroachment of online purchases into their business model, but not for long, as the whole keycard concept seems designed to break the interest of the most dedicated collectors in physical purchases at all. Games in shops will become like top-up cards and vouchers at the supermarket checkout counter, a physical token of abstract content rather than a product which serves as a good in and of itself. For all these reasons, I think the chance of Nintendo utilizing game keys themselves is low. In fact, I'd put it at only a 10% chance that there will be a first party game key card title, or at least one that is exclusive to a game key card. Many games will be expanded with post launch patches, and with Tears of the Kingdom being the current Switch record size at 18.2 gigabytes compared to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's 6.7 gigabytes on the cartridge, it seems improbable that Nintendo will need to go much beyond the 64 gigabyte cap for the Switch 2 era. And if they do, I think they would probably make the case for a larger game and simply add a surcharge for the new cartridge size, as they did with Tears of the Kingdom. However, this wouldn't necessarily be all that easy to do. Economies of scale dictate that while mass-produced game cards could be manufactured for a cheaper price per item, if they just do a one-off 128GB card, that could be difficult, and while the raw storage might be bigger, if they need more or denser chips, the price may be significantly greater and could potentially come with trade-offs technologically in terms of speed. My guess is that part of the discussion with third parties was that ultimately 64 gigabytes was a real Rubicon in terms of profitability, and that offering 128 gigabytes would be extremely difficult. Plus, even from the early days of the Switch, many companies such as EA were basically mandating vast amounts of the content of games be downloaded anyway. A further aspect that may need to be considered is legislative frameworks. Last year, I covered the EU initiative Stop Killing Games, which is still significantly short of the 1 million signatures required even to generate a debate in the EU Parliament. That would, if brought to full law, have enacted regulation mandating that games be made available after the closure of servers, something that would potentially be extremely complicated with keycards, and indeed for much of Nintendo's output. It is possible that legislative approaches to preservation do emerge in the future, but this currently seems a long way off. Even if legislation was introduced in individual territories, and even if it applied to game key cards, it's unlikely to be an issue for the duration of the Switch 2's lifespan. All things considered, then, I can certainly see the logic of the current situation from Nintendo's point of view. Game key cards provide a certain level of protection and flexibility for customers, and as long as Nintendo have no plans to close down the Switch 2 eShop, and in their view, I think they genuinely do intend to keep it around at least into the 2040s, they may feel that the longevity wouldn't be drastically different from other media over the years. It's also likely the case that if they want the Switch and its successors to integrate with the same account system, then they will have no reason to remove any individual title from being downloadable, unless of course a publisher makes a particular request, there is a legal challenge, or something else out of their control. It seems plausible to me that in reality, most keycards could retain functionality for far, far longer than many currently fear. The cards also prevent a glut of insanely priced games with 128GB cards from entering the market, even assuming the technology is there to allow for fast reading of 128GB cards. Since Nintendo themselves are unlikely to acquire them, it allows Nintendo to basically put the ball back into the developer's court. On the other hand, if it were the case that game prices needed to rise and the market just wouldn't support it, then perhaps Nintendo would consider that marketing key card versions of titles at a $10 discount to 128GB card collector's versions could be a good move for some of their absolutely major games, for example, a new Zelda. I really don't think they'll go down this route, as I think they'll want to hold the line on game value, but a generation can be a long time, and if you think how different the world was when the Switch was being launched, it shows that it's smart for Nintendo to have built in this degree of flexibility. Personally, I think it's really depressing that game cards don't represent the totality of a game experience, but with the surfeit of DLC and regular post-launch updates, that ship has sailed a long time ago. Realistically, games will be preserved in the way they've always been preserved, by pirates acting extra legally but semi-ethically, and by Nintendo themselves, as they recognize that their corporate interests are best served by their game library being available in perpetuity, either through Nintendo Switch Online or its successors, or through their digital storefront. So, what can consumers do? Step 1 will be to vote with the wallet and avoid keycards completely, but this may communicate more about the Switch 2 owners' views of third-party games than keycards, and realistically the majority of people won't get behind such an idea. It is likely at some point in time that we will see people trying authentic physical releases, and this of course includes Nintendo, but I suspect the likely cost of the cards in these cases would make the proposition a rather thankless one. For myself, I so rarely buy third-party games anyway, and given the price increases on Switch 2, I'm even less likely to do so now. I don't really like the concept of game keycards very much, but I'm sure the day will come when I have to go in for a keycard game, and I suspect most people will be in the same boat. I suspect Nintendo will continue to view it as a necessity rather than something they're exactly delighted about themselves, but I can't see much changing in the medium term, and we probably just have to hope that more third parties decide to stick to full releases and are rewarded by the market for it. Thanks as ever for watching, and do let me know your thoughts and observations in the comments. Shout out to my Patreon supporters and everybody who likes, shares, and subscribes, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.